Somewhere in the northern Black Sea, a cargo ship sits loaded with Ukrainian wheat. On the bridge, the captain watches a radar blip, a Russian patrol vessel. He doesn't know if it will turn away. Neither does the broker in Cairo who ordered the grain. Neither do the 30 million Egyptians whose subsidized bread depends on it arriving. This is the Black Sea grain corridor, and it may be the most fragile food pipeline on Earth. The Black Sea is not just a body of water, it is a bottleneck. Every ship that loads grain at Odessa, Chornomorsk, carried or Pivdeni must funnel out through a single exit, the Bosphorus strait, controlled by Turkey. Beyond that, it enters the Mediterranean and heads for the ports of North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. There is no alternative sea route. The Danube River handles maybe 15% of Ukraine's agricultural exports by volume. Rail to Poland can absorb a fraction more. But for bulk grain in the quantities the world needs, the Black Sea is the only answer. Before February 2022, most people had never heard of these ports. That changed fast. Ukraine before the war was a global agricultural giant. Together with Russia, it supplied roughly 26% of the world's wheat exports in 2021, according to the FAO. Ukraine alone accounted for around 10% of global wheat trade and was the world's largest exporter of sunflower oil, a position it holds to this day, controlling over a third of global sunflower oil exports as of 2024. According to industry data from Ukraine's Agribusiness Club, it was also a major corn and barley supplier, feeding livestock from Europe to Southeast Asia. When Russia invaded, those ships stopped moving. Ukraine's ports were mined and blockaded. Global wheat prices spiked 50% in weeks. Corn followed. The World Food Program watched in real time as the countries it serves, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, faced a bill they could not pay. Egypt, the world's largest wheat importer, was particularly exposed. The country imports roughly 12.5 million tons of wheat per year, more than 70% of it sourced from the Black Sea region. When prices spiked, Egypt's government, which subsidizes bread for roughly 65 million citizens through its Baladi loaf program, faced a fiscal crisis overlaid on a dollar shortage that was already suffocating the economy. The United Nations and Turkey brokered a deal in July 2022. The Black Sea Grain Initiative opened a monitored corridor through the minefield, inspecting ships in Istanbul to verify cargo. For just over a year it worked. Ukraine exported more than 32 million tons of food through the corridor between August 2022 and July 2023, according to the UN. The peak month hit 4.2 million tons, more than Ukraine had moved in any peacetime month. Then Russia pulled out, July 17, 2023. Within days, Chicago wheat futures jumped 17%. The FAO food price index lurched upward. Egypt braced for another blow. Lebanon, still rebuilding from the Beirut port explosion, faced higher import costs on grain it could barely afford. In Somalia, where food production in 2024 would fall 45% below the long-term average and 1.7 million children under 5 would face acute malnutrition. The collapse of the corridor did not create the crisis, but it made the numbers worse, and it made them worse fastest for the people with the least margin. But here is what surprised the analysts: Ukraine adapted. Without the UN deal, without Russian cooperation, Ukrainian sailors started moving anyway. A new unilateral corridor opened through the western Black Sea, hugging Romanian and Bulgarian territorial waters. By February 2024, the corridor was moving 7.9 million tons per month, nearly double the peak of the UN brokered deal. Ukrainian wheat exports rose 23% between 2023 and 2024, reaching almost 20 million metric tons, according to USDA data. Corn exports climbed 11%. By 2024, 92% of Ukrainian agricultural exports were moving by sea again. Since August 2023, when the unilateral corridor opened, it has delivered more than 162 million tons of cargo to 55 different countries, including over 98 million tons of grain and vegetable oil alone. The cost was courage and luck. Ukrainian drone boats and cruise missiles had degraded Russia's Black Sea fleet severely enough that Kiev could assert a kind of de facto maritime deterrence. Russian strikes continued on the port infrastructure, on grain warehouses, on ships at anchor. But the grain kept moving. That resilience came with a price attached to every voyage. War risk insurance premiums for vessels calling at Ukrainian ports peaked at 1.0 to 1.2% of hull value in 2023. By late 2025, they had dropped but remained at 0.45 to 0.55% per voyage. For a modern bulk carrier worth $50 million carried, that is $250,000 of insurance cost added to a single trip. A cost that travels up the supply chain and lands eventually in the price of a loaf of bread in Cairo or a bag of flour in Aden. And yet the corridor remains what it has always been: a thread, not a chain. The Bosphorus is 700 meters wide at its narrowest. One decision by Ankara, under the Montreux Convention, Turkey controls warship passage, but also shapes the political climate that determines whether commercial shipping feels safe, and the calculus shifts. One sustained Russian missile campaign targeting the Odessa port cluster could cut throughput by half in a week. Russia does not need to sink ships to win. It only needs to make the insurance market price the route as too dangerous for commercial operators to accept. One winter of bad harvests in Kazakhstan or the American plains would place additional pressure on Black Sea supply just as the corridor is stressed. Consider the geometry. Egypt imports over 12 million tons of wheat a year. It has perhaps 3 months of strategic reserves. If the corridor closes and stays closed, the subsidy system that keeps bread at a few cents a loaf for 65 million people does not last the year. There is no emergency supplier ready to fill that gap. The grain markets can reroute some volume through North American or Australian shipments, but at higher freight costs, at longer lead times, and never at the same scale, the logistics of replacing Black Sea grain are not a spreadsheet problem. They are a timeline problem, and the timeline always runs out before the alternatives arrive. The world learned something in 2022 that it had technically always known but had preferred to ignore. Global food security does not rest on a diversified, resilient system. It rests on a handful of ports, one narrow strait, and the patience of a country at war. The wheat will move until it doesn't. And the people who need it most will have no warning when that day comes.